Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. Live on the phone with me today, I have Justine Ruotolo in Los Angeles, California. Justine is a marriage and family therapist and has been an ADD life coach for over 20 years. She helps her clients to embrace their gifts associated with ADD. Justine also hosts a podcast called Miss ADD that's available for free on her website, missadd.com, and on iTunes. She's also the author of the book, ADD Land, The Gift of ADD. Justine, thank you for joining me today.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm so happy to be here with you.
Well, I know I'm a huge fan of your podcast, and I know we discussed before that I work with a number of folks in my career coaching practice who actually have ADHD. And since you work with folks like that, I really wanted to reach out to you to kind of get your perspective.
Okay, that's great.
Well, from a high level, what are some of the challenges that you find your clients face in their careers, folks that have ADHD? I mean, what do you see?
Well, in their careers, for everyone with ADHD, our frontal lobe is missing certain things, and they're called executive function deficits. Mm-hmm. And so if you wanted to look at executive function as the CEO of a company, right? So the CEO of a company, he has to analyze what's happening in the company or analyze a specific task. He has to plan it out. He has to organize all the steps, initiate it, develop it, and then complete it. So there's all different things involved here. There's time management, there's short-term memory issues, there's impulsivity, procrastination, inability to focus. These are the offshoots of the bigger things with executive function deficits. And those are the things that I notice with a lot of clients, adult clients that I work with, that are working. These are the areas where their deficits are really highlighted.
Okay. I've heard that sometimes people, if they're adults that were never diagnosed, that sometimes they have a life event, maybe it's having a child or maybe it's getting a promotion, that makes their issues with ADHD more obvious to them than maybe before.
Yes.
Is that something you notice?
Yes. In fact, for myself, I really did not have any idea that I had ADHD until my oldest son, who's now 27, he was 9 at the time, was diagnosed. And I was working, and things really weren't going well for me at work. I mean, I was really, had a lot of natural things, like I could negotiate very easily because it was just innate in me, and I always did win-win situations with people, so I was a good talker.
Right.
But when it came right down to the organization part of everything, I was falling apart. And so when he got diagnosed and I saw all the symptoms that the doctor was telling me, these are the things that happen when you have ADD, and how he was struggling in school and the things that just weren't going right for him, it reminded me of myself. And so I then took the initiative to go off and get diagnosed, and sure enough, I did have ADHD. And then looking back on what was happening at work, I realized, wow, okay, this is definitely an issue, definitely a problem.
And if you, if someone who's listening realizes, if it resonates with them, what we're talking about, I mean, what, as an adult, I mean, as a child, often you can be identified in school.
Yes.
But as an adult, what do you do?
Well, I often tell adults that come to me and they're not sure whether or not they have ADD. And I just want to be clear for everybody who's listening that sometimes it's misdiagnosed or overdiagnosed. So, the inattention piece of this, the dysregulation, the inability to regulate your emotions, can also have a lot to do with depression and anxiety. So you just want to make sure that you go to a psychiatrist, because this is a medical condition. And so unless you go to a therapist who does the TOVA, T-O-V-A, those are initials for a test that is done online to help diagnose ADHD, that coupled with a psychiatrist's evaluation is what you need to really be diagnosed with ADHD. So that's always been my advice. And the first thing I tell people to do is get a physical.
Oh.
Because I have actually had people in my practice who have had thyroid issues that they didn't know about. And it was causing them to have a lot of mental disorder symptoms.
Okay.
Like inability to focus. That's a big one with the thyroid. Like depression symptoms, anxiety symptoms. So I always suggest for people, and this was something that we were told in graduate school that we needed to do when we're doing our first assessment, go and get yourself a physical if you haven't had one. If you've recently had one within the past year and you have your blood work and everything's fine, then my suggestion would be I have a checklist that I do with people, and I spend time talking to them, and I will usually ask if they will sign a release so I can talk to the psychiatrist so we can kind of decide together what's going on.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Okay. Well, as I mentioned earlier, you have a podcast, and I'm a big fan of it. I recommend it to my clients who have ADD. And one of the things in your podcast that you often discuss is the gifts of ADD, which I think is a very different perspective that often people who have ADD don't hear. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit to our listeners about what you mean by ADD being a gift.
Yes, I would love to, because it is very different than a lot of people, and I really embrace my own ADD. ADD alone, now, without the co-occurring disorders, which are depression and anxiety or bipolar, personality disorders, the list continues, or the executive function deficits that we're not in control of, inability to focus, no follow-through, impulsivity, procrastination, time management, never being on time, losing things, short-term memory issues, and a big one is emotional regulation, the ability to regulate your emotions. All these things are why people don't see this as a gift. 5 years ago, when I started this journey that I'm on of getting better, I realized I became very self-aware, and I realized that I needed some help with all these deficits, and I also recognized a lot of things about myself that I didn't like. The way I was controlling, I didn't like that at all. And I wasn't a very positive person, very negative. But when I started to work on this, and I used mindfulness and meditation a lot to help me get in the moment, which is a powerful place to be, because in the future, there's anxiety, and in the past, there's depression. That's when the fear is lifted and the gifts come out, because we are extremely creative people, very, very creative. In fact, the front of my book was designed by my younger son, who's also an artist and a musician, and it's the Hollywood signs overlaid with ADD, because I tell kids that I work with all the time, there wouldn't be a Hollywood if there wasn't for ADD, because of the creative side of the people that work there. So that's how I see it as a gift. And the book was put together to actually help parents and children and adolescents to kind of see this more in a positive vein than to look at it as a death sentence.
Oh,
Because
sure.
I want to say to parents who are listening out there that if you're positive instead of negative about this diagnosis, your children are going to be more positive. They're going to feel better about what's going on.
Right, right. And I think it's interesting, too, because they're not the only ones kind of going through these issues.
Right.
You know?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's great, especially because you live in California. You get a chance to kind of firsthand see some of the benefits that folks bring to the table when they do have ADD. And it is a struggle, but, like you said, there's a lot of creativity and things that can come out as well.
And, I do run 2 adult support groups in the L.A. area under CHAD, Children and Adults with ADD. So, the support groups are $5. And in the Culver City group, there's more people from the Hollywood side. We have one gentleman who's a writer. He is so incredibly creative. It's just, it just gets me so excited when I see how he writes. But he struggles with the deficits. He struggles with those negative symptoms, as I like to call them. And so that's why he's coming to the group, to try and get in control of that so his writing can even get better.
Absolutely, absolutely. I spoke with a group last week here in Memphis. I was on a panel, and one of the questions that came from the audience was, if you could speak to yourself, 20 years ago when you were in college, what would you tell yourself that you've learned since then? And my response was, I would focus more on my strengths than on things that I don't do well.
Wow.
And I think that's really what I hear when you talk about ADD being a gift, is that you are trying to help people get it under control, but you're trying to get them to focus on what they're doing really well.
Yes.
More.
Yeah, and we tend to, especially adults, in the older adults like myself, because I grew up and my nickname basically was lazy, stupid procrastinator. But remember, in the Stone Age, they didn't know anything about ADD. They had absolutely no idea what it was. So I was just looked at as somebody who was very lazy and didn't want to do it, and that wasn't who I was. But because of those words, a lot of us grew up focusing on the negatives, not focusing on the positives. But that's very true, because when I was in college, if I was focusing more on the positives, things would have went a little bit better than they did.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, from what you see working with clients, do you think there are certain jobs that work well for someone who has ADD? I mean, are there things you might recommend people take a look at or consider?
Yes, I absolutely do. And it's very funny, because a lot of people, when I tell them the story, they say, really? I can't even picture that. Emergency room doctors. I was in the emergency room about a year ago, and this doctor came up to me, and he was just buzzing all over the bed. And I said to him, has anybody ever told you that you have ADD? And he said, how did you know that? So I pulled out my card, which he loved, because it said Miss ADD. And he's like, can I have a few of them? Because everybody in this room has ADD. And he and I talked a lot about it, and it's because it's fast-paced. There's a lot of stuff going on, and some of us really like that kind of work. And I said to him, was it difficult getting through medical school? And he said, yeah, it was, but I had to come up with strategies that worked for me, and I had to be very, very structured during that time of going to school. So that's something that made me very excited. And since that time, I've met other people. I met another emergency room doctor when I went to Lydia Zylowska's seminar up in Petaluma, and he told me the same thing. So that's one thing. Policemen and firefighters is another thing that I see a lot of, because they multitask. They do a lot of things. It's not the same thing every single day. That's one of the things that it can be very difficult for us, is mundane. That's why school can be difficult for us, because if it's not our passion that we're studying at the time, like the general ed classes that kids have to take in colleges, it can be very boring, and then we just kind of walk away. Sales is another one, because, like you can tell, a lot of us like to talk. I'm one of those people.
That's interesting. Sure.
Yeah, and so we really enjoy talking to other people, especially when it's one-on-one. And so that's another one. Artists, musicians, entertainers. Here they're all able to use their creative side in a very positive way. And the biggest one for me, because that's what I am at this point, is an entrepreneur. And what I noticed is both my brother and I are entrepreneurs, and, I'm sure he's not going to admit this, but he definitely has ADD. And it's interesting, because when I was working for someone, that was difficult for me, because I had to live by their schedule. I couldn't live by mine. I was able to do this podcast with you this morning because I make my own schedule.
Right.
But I'm also very driven, because it's my company, it's my business, and it's also my passion. So, you look at people like the gentleman who owns Virgin America. He's a multi-billionaire, and he he has talked about it. I've seen him on talk shows that he has ADD. He's also in my book. So entrepreneurs are another big one. And then also outside sales are big for people like real estate. You know, they get to be outside. They're not stuck in an office.
Oh.
They don't have to sit on a phone all day and talk to one person or, you know, a bunch of clients that they have. They can go out. They can drive. We need different stimuli. That's what makes us happy.
That makes sense. And I like all the suggestions you've given that don't require a lot of additional education, because I think people get a chance, you know, they can try something different without, you know, investing so much money.
And, you know, I do want to say one more thing, too. Last week at CHAD, we had a speaker. His name is Dr. Siggy Hale, and he is a scientist, a neuroscientist from UCLA. And he and I were talking, and he said to me, "So you have ADHD?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "You're a therapist?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, the best therapists I've ever met," and probably he means coaches as well, are people that have ADHD because they're very intuitive.
Oh, that's interesting.
I can walk into a room, and I can tell you about probably 90% of the people in the room by just sizing them up.
Right.
So it really hit me when he said that to me. It really made a lot of sense. So for your listeners, if anybody's thinking about going into therapy, be a great job for you.
Sure, that's great.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny, you know, when I first started my practice, you know, doing career coaching, I was approached by someone who, here in Memphis, who coaches people who have ADHD. And he told me, "I really think you're going to find that you have a lot of clients who have ADHD." And I said, "No, that won't happen." And shortly after I went into business, I had 2 or 3 people come in and self-disclose that was something they were struggling with. And so it was really interesting to understand, you know, that was an issue that was going to be coming up more often.
Yeah, and it really does. It's amazing how many people out there do absolutely have it and struggle at work. They really do.
Right. But I do think it's smart on those people's, you know, behalf to reach out and get help in areas where maybe you struggle a little bit more.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a great idea. So we talked about all the jobs that work well for people who have ADHD. What are some of the ones that you see where people really struggle, jobs that just are very difficult?
So it's interesting. That's a really good question. What I notice is that people that are stuck at a desk all day, that's very hard for them, where they have to punch a clock, they have to be in at a certain time and out at a certain time and have a certain amount of time for lunch. And they're in kind of bullpen kind of situation, because I notice a lot of people who have ADD, myself included, can get distracted very easily.
Sure.
But not everybody can have an indoor office. So the other thing that I noticed is like accounting.
Okay.
I had a gentleman who, I don't know why he did this, but he didn't know he had ADD. So he went to school and he became an accountant, and he also got his CPA, which is very difficult to do, but he did. And now he and I are actually working on him getting into the entertainment industry.
Oh, wow.
Because he is so bored. I mean, just completely bored. So I think anything that's mundane and the same every day, the absolute same routine, is something that for people who are ADD, we're not linear and progressive. So we don't go A, B, C, D. We go A to Z, and then we try to figure out how to get back to the other letters. That's the out-of-the-box thinking that we do. People, if you notice, who are accountants, they have a very difficult time with that kind of thinking. Their thinking is very linear. There are a lot of attorneys, although I have met a couple that do have ADHD, but most of them are very linear thinkers. You know, and I think you have to be in that setting. So I would just say anything that has I don't want to say too much structure. Structure is important, but anything that makes us feel like we're trapped.
Okay.
So going to work every day at the same time, going to lunch every day at the same time, leaving at the same time, and doing the same work every day over and over again, most likely would not work for somebody with ADHD.
That makes sense. That makes sense. What about things that involve a lot of detail? Is that more or less difficult?
It can be difficult, but it depends on whether or not it's your passion.
Okay.
If it's your passion, you're going to hyper-focus on it. And so even though people will say that hyper-focusing can be a negative thing, it can also be very much a positive thing. So if it's your passion and there's tons of detail and you're hyper-focusing, you're going to get it done. It's going to make you feel good. So it just really depends on what type of ADD you have also.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Well, I mean, occasionally I will meet with people who really are not, they're really struggling at work, but they're not quite to a place where they haven't found another job yet, for example, and they're trying to come up with strategies to make their current job situation better because they're just having such a hard time. Do you have certain strategies that you recommend to help
Yes.
people who are having a hard time?
Yes, I do. So I can run down some of the things that I am familiar with,
Sure.
not only with myself, but people that I work with. So one of the things is short attention span. This is something that's difficult for all of us. And so a recommendation that I come up with people is a change in the schedule, a break in the routine, or a job where the employee can do something more stimulating. So, for example, a break in the schedule. So if you're having a hard time paying attention, something about what you're doing is not feeding the creative side.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to get up and move around a little bit. Go and meditate for 3 minutes. Go look out the window, or if you don't have a window, focus on something in your room. Get something on your desk that makes you feel good. And if you can focus on that for about 3 minutes, and while the thoughts are coming up, you just release them, it kind of gets you in the moment in a very peaceful place. And the attention span comes back.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's attention span. Distractibility.
Okay.
We talked about this a little bit before when
Sure.
I talked about people being in a bullpen. In fact, one of my clients, I encouraged them to go to their boss and explain, under ADA, American Disabilities Act, that they had attention deficit disorder and that they could not focus sitting in the bullpen.
Right.
Hearing noise. So they actually gave him an inside office with a door.
Wow.
So, yeah. So my suggestion is if you have an office, if you have a door, close the office door if you're feeling that you're getting distracted. Or as they did for this gentleman, ask to have your office moved to a lower traffic area. I mean, there are situations where there may not be indoor offices available for everybody, so maybe moving it to the back. I remember I used to be in a bullpen when I was a buyer in Washington, D.C., and I remember my cubicle was all the way in the back where not a lot of people came, and that really helped me with the distraction, even though at that time I did not know.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, and you can ask for that. So moving their inboxes, now this is a really good one. If you take your inbox and you put it outside your office, then people just drop things in there, and your door is closed, and then you're not dealing with interruptions all the time.
Right.
Yeah. And so also asking all the employees to wear headsets when they're on the phone. So this way people can see that you're on the phone. You're focusing on that phone conversation. I don't know about you, but when I'm on the phone and somebody is trying to get my attention or talk to me, I can't do two things at one time.
Yeah, it's difficult. For me, I actually, I have a full office where I meet with clients, and I have a sign on the door that I switch, and one side says open and the other side says like meeting in progress. And if I am trying to, if I'm meeting with a client or if I'm trying to focus on something important, I put it on the meeting in progress side so that no one, just comes in.
Right. Exactly, because that interruption can be very difficult. And, whether you have ADD or you don't have ADD doesn't matter, because I think any kind of interruption when you're in a thought process can be difficult for anybody.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So hyper-focusing, before I spoke about it can have a negative side or it can have a positive side. So I think sometimes what happens with people who are working is they get so focused on a task, and it may be something that they really, really enjoy, that they forget that they had a to-do list.
Right.
And there are other things on the list. And speaking of to-do lists, I tell people to put the most difficult thing on the top. Don't put it on the bottom, because by the time you get done with the easy things, you wouldn't have any energy left for the difficult thing. So, in terms of hyper-focusing, break your task down into manageable pieces or chunks, and set an alarm. I use my iPhone a lot for alarms to just kind of remind me, okay, in 10 minutes, because I had a break, I've got a client coming. So I have to wrap up what I'm doing. So using the alarms, you remind yourself that you have other things to do on your to-do list. But here's the piece. This is kind of funny. You've got to pay attention to the alarm.
Right.
You can't just hear it and ignore it. You've got to, your brain, you have to say, okay, that alarm just went off, which means what I'm doing right now, I have to put aside and get to the other things that are on my list. That's really important.
Absolutely.
So then people who are hyperactive sometimes can feel very trapped in an office setting. If they're in, like I said, it's really great when you can go out, right? So if you are, my suggestion would be that you take some short breaks.
Okay.
And you possibly just take a walk outside, or even just take a walk around where you are. Go to the bathroom, come back, something that's going to help you to just, take care of that need that you have to move.
Okay.
So another big thing with people at work is memory problems.
Okay.
So they forget information. They may be they may have auditory processing. So somebody's talking to them and they're not getting it the first time around.
Okay, so it's
So
not
one
clicking.
of the things I tell people to do is get one of those really small recorders. Not even your phone, because your phone sometimes is going to ring in the middle of everything. So get a small, tiny digital recorder. I actually got one for graduate school, and put it on your desk. So if people come in and they're telling you things, you now have it on tape so that you can replay it and possibly make notes about what they said.
Well, that's a great idea.
Yeah, and it really does help. I've had a couple of people do it, and they felt like it's really helped them to be able to digest better what the person is saying. You can also follow up some verbal conversations with emails so that everybody has written records of everything, because we tend to maybe with our short-term memory forget things. So having a book, I know people want to use their phones, but I have to tell you that I tell people to get a book, use a book, a date book, and write everything down in there.
Yeah, I agree.
Had a conversation on this day about, write an email and highlight it so that when you open the book, it jumps out at you and you know that there's something that you have to do.
My favorite, I recommend to my clients who kind of struggle with their schedule, is I recommend they go to an office supply store and look for one of these date books that it's typically called like a collegiate planner.
Yes.
Because I like the ones that have both a month at the beginning of each month, a full month, and then they have a weekly section for each, so that you can sort of high level look at what you're doing, but then on each day you have lots of space to write notes for yourself.
Right, which is great. And that's what I have. That is my book. I have a month at a glance. So I've got all my appointments written on that page, but I also have them inside so I can make little notes about each client or anything else that I'm doing. Very helpful. And what I noticed, though, and you're going to probably have seen this too, is with the younger clients, the ones who use the phone all the time, they want to put everything in their phone, which I understand. I get that. And they sync it to their computer, which is great. But I still encourage them to write. I encourage everybody to write.
I think it's nice. You can see it all laid out together.
Oh, yeah. And the other piece of this is, I found this out in graduate school. When you write, your right hand is a direct line to your hippocampus, which is what stores memory. And so when I would write out all of my test stuff, like my study guides, when I wrote them out, I used to use colors, I really didn't have to go back and study because it went in, and I knew it. So I really do encourage people to write, because I can tell you today, right now on the phone, what my schedule is for the rest of the week without looking at my book, because I wrote it. So, and not many people go, really? Yeah, well, try it. It works. Here's a big one. Time management is a big one. First of all, being on time can be difficult for a lot of people. And I've had some adults say to me, nah, it's okay, you can be 5 minutes late to work. No, you can't. Because that is the making of a pink slip. Because there's really very little tolerance. I remember this because years ago, I was late a lot, and I was almost fired over it. So you cannot be late. So what I tell people is to work back into what it's going to take to leave the house. So, for example, if I have a 7:30 appointment in the morning, I have to get up at 6 because I want to have breakfast, and I need to go on my computer, because my inbox, I empty it every day. I have folders so that when I turn on my computer, I don't have 10,000 emails staring at me. That's another way of feeling very scattered. So I go to my computer, I check my bank every day to make sure I haven't been hacked, because that's happened. I get in the shower, and I'm out the door at 7:30 to get to work by 8. Okay, so I worked back into that. But here's the big piece of this. You can't let anything exit you. No squirrels can show up. You have to stay on task. The other piece of time management is when you have a project that's due at work, breaking it down, taking the time to really think about, okay, this is due in 2 weeks. What are the steps involved, and how do I break this down? And that's where I would suggest that people have coaches, if they don't know how to do this, to really help them find that skill and learn how to use it.
Absolutely.
It's really important, because they're multitasking and doing a lot of things. Besides that project, they have their daily things that they have to get done.
Right. Absolutely. Well, you mentioned earlier that you've worked with a client who, he disclosed his ADD to his employer to get accommodations. Are there certain times that you recommend people disclose versus you recommend they don't disclose? I tell people to get a feel for who their employer is. When I was getting my hours for my license, I was working at a clinic for methadone, and I immediately, when I started working there, I went to my supervisor and sat down with him and explained to him that I had ADHD. I told him that I felt like I was in control of most of my negative symptoms, which he understood because he was also a clinician. But I said, it may take me a little longer, that learning curve may take a little longer, and I'm just kind of giving you a heads up. And he was fine with that. If he wasn't, then I probably would have pulled the American Disabilities Act card because I am entitled to accommodations. So I say to people, feel out the situation and see how you feel about it. I don't encourage people to talk about it during an interview process because they could definitely turn you down without saying they're turning you down because of the ADD, but most likely that's what it is. I'm not asking you to lie. If somebody asks you directly, I encourage everybody to be honest. But if it doesn't come up, I wouldn't bring it up at that point. But as things progress, like case in point, this gentleman that I'm still working with, he just could not function where he was. So he got a letter from his psychiatrist who explained the fact that he had ADHD and went into human resources, and they were great. They were wonderful about it. They were willing to do, because they really liked him.
See, that's the other piece of it.
Mm-hmm.
They saw him as somebody that would really grow with their company, and
Right.
they didn't want to get rid of him. And the other thing is, human resources today have areas that you can go up and you can talk to people. So, it's employment assistance programs. That's what they are.
Right.
So people that have depression or are struggling with social things at work or ADHD or anxiety, they actually can go up there and they have clinicians on staff. It's not everybody's company, but a lot of the big companies have this, that you can actually do therapy at work.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and it's free. So it's something to just be aware of. If whoever's listening, I would Google your company and see if they have it.
Oh, that's great. Well, I think one thing, too, to keep in mind, and you mentioned sort of getting to know the group of people you're working with. I mean, I think you're very fortunate being in California. California is very progressive around some of these issues.
Yes.
In Tennessee, I don't know that I would say we here are that progressive over a lot of different issues. I would probably put this into that bucket.
Yeah.
So I think it's important. And I think, during the interview process, I agree, it's not a good idea, in my view, to disclose. And I think during the interview, I think legally they're actually not allowed to ask you that question during the interview process.
That's good to know.
Yeah, I think it's on the list, I believe, of illegal questions, along with things like, do you have children?
They can't ask you that? I didn't know that.
I don't think so. I think it's on a list along with things like, are you married? What religion are you? There are a lot of protections in terms
That's
of
good to know.
questions. Yeah, I mean, you definitely want to Google it for the exact list, but the problem is that most companies, actually I've never really seen a company that does this well, most companies don't train their employees on how to do an interview. So sometimes while you're in an interview, you do face these questions unexpectedly. I recently interviewed a man who wrote a book about behavioral interviewing, and I think he's actually from Memphis. His name is Paul Green, and he wrote the book in the 70s, so he's been doing this for a long time. And we actually talked about illegal questions, and he has in his book some really snappy responses that you can kind of give back.
Good to know.
To kind of keep it moving, well, I don't, with the children, if someone were to ask you if you have children, he kind of would say, well, I haven't really decided if I'm going to have more children, but either way, I'm a great employee. And
that's great.
But I think at the end of the day, with the interview process, you're trying to minimize distractions. Anything that takes away from your talent, your skill, the strengths that you bring to the table, I put those on the back burner. Those can come up later, and I would put this in that list.
Yes. No, absolutely. I wouldn't. And again, just because I was open and honest about it,
sure,
I'm not encouraging everybody to run out and do that.
Right.
But I do want people to know that they are protected under the American Disabilities Act.
Right. And I think it's important for folks to be really familiar with those protections. I think that is very important.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And anybody can Google that and look it up, and it's very easily understood. It really is.
Right. Well, so in the workplace, and I think I've seen this some in school as well, but something I've observed with folks who have ADD is that they sometimes have to work harder than those around them, a lot of times, to get the same results. But sometimes it seems like in the end, they actually get better at some of those tasks than their peers. I don't know, is this something that you've seen?
Yeah, I have experienced it. There is some of my clients that I work with will come in and tell me that they're looking around at the other people, and these are more of the mundane things that they have to do rather than the creative, because what I see is in the creative things, they seem to just take over and run through them. It's not difficult. But more of the mundane things, maybe, following up on emails that come through, making sure they're at meetings on time, setting alarms, working harder on paperwork or projects that have to get done. And for myself, I can tell you, when I worked in the business world, I did have to work harder, especially we had different things as a buyer that we had to hand in every week. And I did get better than other people. It turned out that, at some point, my boss was saying, wow, like, your work is like better than anybody else's because I put that extra time and effort into it. And if you really want to keep your job and you're happy at your job, that's something that you're going to have to do. Some of us have to work harder. And you know what? It's got nothing to do with level of intelligence.
Right.
I just want to say that because most of us who have ADD are very, very intelligent people. It's just those executive function deficits that at times get in the way. So it's kind of like you go out and you bodybuild with a trainer. It's kind of like bodybuilding your mind and getting your mind to that place where you have now created that executive secretary in the brain that was missing when you first started this process.
That's great. I mean, I think that's such great advice, and I think, it reiterates the part, one of the positive things that can come with having ADD, even though it's a struggle.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, it is.
Well, I've spoken with a number of folks who have ADD, I would say especially here in Memphis, who maybe don't feel like they have a good support system here. Maybe they weren't diagnosed as children. Maybe they're a little bit older or something. I mean, you mentioned earlier CHAD. Can you talk a little bit about what is CHAD and what other resources might be available for someone who's struggling with this issue?
Yes. So CHAD is children and adults with ADD, and actually over the past 5 years, CHAD has shifted their focus more to adults. In the beginning, and I don't know really, I think they may be 30 years old, I want to say. I know that the majority of their information was related to children because of parents, and they still do that, but they have shifted, like their national conference that is held all over the country. They shift every year more towards the adult population. So you can go on their website. It's chad.org. And what I would encourage people who are listening is to then look in your particular state. So like in the state of California, I think there's probably 4 or 5 chapters of CHAD. We are in the South Bay chapter.
Okay.
And everybody does their own thing. What you're going to find is there'll be a speaker series. Most likely they'll have speakers come in to talk, which are very helpful. And they may even have support groups. I run 2 support groups for CHAD. I'm sure, positive, there has to be support groups around the country. And if it's not through CHAD, what I would do is just go on and Google ADD adult support groups in whatever area, Memphis, wherever you are, and see what you come up with. And here's the other thing. For any of you who are listening who feel like you're doing pretty well with your ADD, start your own support group.
That's a good idea.
I mean, you really help so many people by just getting people together and having them in a room where there's love, there's acceptance, there's trust, and everybody feels like they have each other's back. In my group, the one in Torrance, which I've had for 5 years now, we have people exchanging phone numbers and checking up with each other during the week. The one in Culver City is new. It just started in June, and I know we're going to get there as well. It's just a wonderful feeling to be in a room with other people who understand you.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's a powerful feeling. It really is. So I would just suggest that you look around and see what's out there. Besides CHAD, there are other people who are doing things. Here's the other thing on Facebook. For your listeners who belong to Facebook, I have 2 pages. One is Miss ADD Group page where you can definitely get on there and blog and ask me questions.
Okay.
And then I just have a Miss ADD page where a lot of my posts are on.
Okay.
My website, I have a blog on my website as well. And there's hundreds of groups on Facebook. All you have to do is type in ADHD. There's groups for parents. There's groups for adults. There's groups for all different kinds of ADHD and different kinds of co-occurring disorders that come with it, like oppositional defiant disorder for children is a big one. So a lot of questions are being answered from the administrators on those groups. So that's another good way to
that's
connect.
Great. That's great. And I
people.
noticed on the CHAD website as well that when they don't have a local chapter, they have some kind of a national support that
Yes.
you can kind of do virtually. I'm not quite sure of the details, but
It's a webinar. They have a
okay.
webinar, and I think it's monthly, and they have all different topics. So again, it's chad.org,
okay.
and you can probably just look at the national topics that they're going to have on webinars.
Oh, that's excellent.
Yeah, and they're free, so it's great.
Oh, that's great. Well, we've covered a lot of really good information here. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with our listeners today?
I think I want to leave everybody with this message of let's get to that positive place.
Mm-hmm.
Let's not give up, because I know that at times things about the symptoms of ADHD can be very difficult, but we're all really good people, and I'm going to have a workbook that's coming out hopefully in December.
Well, that's great.
And I'm going to be utilizing the steps that I used for myself, that I use with my groups and my individual clients to help everybody get better. And it's just they're positive steps to get to that good place. Meditation, and it doesn't have to be sitting still, because I have a lot of people that complain to me about, I can't sit still. Then get up and walk and meditate. I meditate while I drive. Well, I better, because I'm in the moment.
Right.
I'm aware of everything that's going on. I meditate when I walk. It's just a powerful vehicle to help you feel good, to help you stay positive. And that's what I want everybody to feel from me, is the positive energy that I bring when I work with people, when I'm on podcasts, when I have groups, because I just get up every day and I feel really blessed to be able to get up and to help other people. And I have ADHD, and I'm positive about it. So that's my message. I'm just a very positive individual. I wasn't 5 years ago, but I really have changed. And that has helped me help others.
Oh, that's excellent. So do you work with clients outside of California?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And if people want to contact you, if listeners today are interested to reach out and get some help from you, what's the best way to reach you?
2 ways. They can email me at Justine@missadd.com, or I'll also give them my direct phone number. It's 310-735-5874, or on my website at missadd.com.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you so much, Justine, for joining me. This has been excellent.
This has been wonderful. Thank you, Angie, for inviting me on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for listening. Tune in next week for another edition of the Copeland Coaching Podcast. If you've enjoyed the program today, please be sure to subscribe on iTunes so you never miss an episode, and consider leaving a review in the iTunes store.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.